Hola, scholars. Today we are looking at the Knowledge for Justice textbook, and I have two chapters we will be discussing. That is Chapter 3, Gender and Sexuality, and then Chapter 4, which is the Arts and Cultural Production chapter. We're going to start with Gender and Sexuality. I will have you turn to page 269 if you're following along with your textbook. And I'm just going to go through some key points for each article or essay that's included in this chapter that you should recognize as you're reading it. And then you can reach out on Canvas if you have more questions. So the first one is on page 269, and that is towards a Mariposa Consciousness, reimagining queer Chicano and Latino identities. This piece is by Daniel Enrique Perez, and it's very much about empowerment through this lens of a Mariposa consciousness, or he talks a lot about Hotoria in here, and we're going to look at that just a little bit. So, for instance, the definition is on page 269, which is in the first paragraph. And specifically, it's about reimagining queer Chicano and Latino identity, and it's a form of empowering those identities. So it's in the, I guess, second full sentence here. It says, I begin by laying the foundation for what I call Mariposa theory, a theoretical framework drawing on post-colonial theory, queer theory, and an examination of butterfly imagery in ancient and contemporary cultural texts, and the reappropriation and resignification of the term Mariposa. So there's some really big words discussed in that one sentence. Post-colonial theory. First of all, that means post-colonial time or colonial period, with colonization being when white European settlers came to, quote, the New World and conquered and / developed or discovered new lands with native peoples on it. So post-colonial theory implies an end to colonization, or a period of after colonization in which it wasn't condoned to colonize in the same way in a general fashion. Queer theory is LGBTQ plus studies, which is going to be talked a lot in this chapter, actually. LGBTQ, if you haven't heard the acronym, is lesbian, gay, bisexual, LGBT, transgender, Q, queer. And then if you have the plus, it adds on a whole bunch of other letters that I'm not including. So typically, a lot of people use the plus to imply extra ways of identifying oneself, usually through a sexual orientation or whatnot. So that's the LGBTQ. So queer theory. And then butterfly images. There's some textual analysis in this piece surrounding that to give you an example. And then he says the reappropriation and resignification of the term. So if someone tells you this is green and you want to disagree and you want to say, no, this isn't green, this is actually blue, it involves you convincing a group of people to re-signify or re-explain the meaning of a word. And so that's what the author is saying here. So as you're reading into this essay, again, the word or the phrasing of a Mariposa is again described on page 270. So the very next page, the second full paragraph, the first sentence, The author says the term Mariposa, which is commonly used to describe Hispanic males who engage in non-heteronormative gender and sexual behavior, with an emphasis on attributes typically associated with femininity. And then he continues, I am especially interested in examining the way butterfly imagery is employed and reappropriated as a metaphor for non-heteronormative gender and sexuality. And so, again, a lot being said in that one sentence. Non-heteronormative gender and sexual behavior means anything that is not comprising a male body and a female body engaging in intimate relations with each other. So heteronormativity is this idea that heterosexuality is the dominant norm or the dominant way of expressing intimate love or affections or sexual desires for another individual. And the author is saying Hispanic males can engage in something different, both gender and sexual behavior, and that it doesn't matter if it's associated with femininity, or the emphasis on femininity is important to note. So, as you continue reading in this section, at the bottom of 270 and then going on for a few pages, he begins to give you the history of the term Mariposa and when it was first associated with same-sex men or relationships, and that history of the butterfly is continued all the way through page 274. And the Hotoria that I was discussing before, and a Hotoria consciousness, is described on page 273. It's in the middle of the second full paragraph. And it says, besides shaping a mestiza consciousness, Anzaldúa and other Chicana lesbian feminists have been instrumental in shaping Hotoria consciousness, an awareness of the social locations, social relations, and histories of Hotoria subjects, especially Chicana lesbians. So again, consciousness, when you hear that term, it's about how a group self-identifies themselves, how they fit in not only among their community, but within their own understanding of their self, their sense of self. And this is, again, very specific with the LGBTQ plus community. And the author says specifically lesbian or Chicana lesbians. The reason this is so empowering is discussed at the bottom of page 273. So it says here, these works are instrumental in contributing to this Hotoria consciousness, provides people an opportunity to learn about themselves and their unique heritage. And then he continues it at the very last sentence of 273. Anzaldúa suggests that mestizas must know their history and embrace all aspects of their identities, as disparate as they may seem. And so that goes on to 274. So it's this idea of if you know your history, you will know yourself. Know history, know self, with a K-N-O-W. And then I think a really great connection point with our class, especially, is this notion of the dichotomy between race and gender, or race and sexuality. That's discussed on page 274 and the second full paragraph. And it says, like the black-white dichotomy, the racial dichotomy, the masculine-feminine dichotomy is an ideological construct. These are terms that can be dismantled and redefined, like racism and the privilege of whiteness. The invention and privileging of masculinity has real and dire consequences. Therefore, one must resist any acts, verbal, physical, or mental, that devalue the feminine or any acts of love and desire in which a person may engage. And then he goes on to describe how love is valuable, and that masculinity and femininity are not mutually exclusive to each other. So again, an ideological construct, another way of saying that we've learned in the class, is a social construct. So the way we understand gender, the way we understand desire, the way we understand sexuality has all been constructed by society around us, shaping what is right and wrong, or what is normal or abnormal. And so he's drawing a connection between race, racism, and masculinity, and sexism, and gender and sexuality discussions. So this is a really great piece to start off the chapter with. And really the rest of the article is giving you all examples of how the author uses Mariposa Consciousness to analyze pieces of writing or analyze art. Like, for instance, towards a Mariposa Consciousness, right here on the bottom of 274, there is a poem, and it's giving you examples about being resilient, beautiful, that you can soar, migrating, having strength to survive. And the poem itself is in the shape of a butterfly. So then as you're reading this chapter, you're going to see some ways the theory is utilized in academia. Again, another kind of butterfly looking poem here. And then there are some pretty amazing artwork that he analyzes. So I'm going to skip ahead from this piece to the future of the LGBTQ Asian American and Pacific Islander community in 2040 essay. That's on page 295. And really what this essay is pretty small, or short, I would say, is delineating the importance of identifying the lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and queer community in AAPI, which is Asian American and Pacific Islander community populations. Because they talk about how this community is growing in numbers, and because of that, so is the numbers of the LGBTQ community within Asian American Pacific Islander enclaves, or so to speak, with census data and that kind of stuff. And so they do talk a little bit about the collection of the data for this chapter and census data in general, and that it's really hard to measure someone's sexual orientation because it's based on sexual behaviors, sexual attractions. The transgender population themselves can be hard to delineate because they encompass both gender identities or a variance form of gender expression or gender queerness, which, if you're trying to get someone to select one box of male or female, transgender doesn't necessarily just encompass one box. It's more complicated than that, or it can be more complicated than that. They even give the example here in the essay on page 296 that Facebook has more than 50 gender options when you're going on there and choosing your profile information. So, and then of course, another reason data can be very difficult to collect is that people are afraid of stigma and discrimination when they self-identify themselves as sometimes a member of the LGBTQ plus community. And so that could result in individuals not answering the data accurately to represent the vast number of those in the community that might identify both as Asian American or Pacific Islander and a member of the LGBTQ plus. So I think that's really important that they set up the limitations, but that it is still important to do this kind of research and conduct it, especially for such a vastly growing community of color. I would say that they give you a very, very minor history of the LGBTQ plus movement, starting at the bottom of 296, that carries over into 297. They stress that the advancements that we've made within LGBTQ rights can just as easily go or shift the other way, which we're living it right now. It's really scary to think about the anti-gay aspects of our society, or the anti-trans harassment, the violence, the hate crimes that they discuss for the history portion that are unfortunately still occurring today. I would say, as you read the rest of this, a section that really spoke to me a lot was towards the end, the community-based organizations on page 302. And the reason this one spoke a lot to me is because it was asking you to look at groups that are advocating already right now in our country, like the National Queer Asian Pacific Islander Alliance and other organizations that are engaging in social support, educational outreach, political activism work, social networking for expanding places to interact with those within the community. And it talks a lot about what activism can be like in places like Los Angeles, San Francisco, New York, and why these community-based organizations are important. So that's really it for that chapter. I'm going to take us to negotiating American Indian inclusion, sovereignty, same-sex marriage, and sexual minorities in Indian country. That starts on page 307. And I'm going to try to go through it pretty fast so we can get to chapter 4. So really, this one is a very interesting chapter because it's talking about a lot of what would seem like flaws within Native American or American Indian communities in terms of how they approach queerness and same-sex marriages, and how it's different from the US's approach to same-sex marriage. And I think one of the reasons why it's like that is discussed on page 312. So they give you the court case that very recently allowed gay marriages to occur here in the United States, which was the 2015 Obergefell versus Hodges decision. And the issue with some of the tribal communities that are being discussed in this chapter is discussed at the bottom of page 312. Tribal sovereignty is very important to tribes, and they don't want to just adopt what the U.S. does. And then they talk about how 3 states that were banning same-sex marriages between a certain time period resulted in the first same-sex couples to be legally married by Indian tribes under tribal law. And the reason tribes don't want to blindly follow in United States government law and legislation footsteps is because of that complicated colonial history that exists between sovereign nations in our country and the US government, which enforced all the genocide and colonial aspects based on we know what is best for you mentality. We're trying to kill the savage but save the man kind of mentality. So they approach same-sex marriage with a vast array of inclusivity or exclusivity. On page 316, they talk a little bit about a work called Becoming Two-Spirit that explored the ways that some of these men pursued personal empowerment in ceremony context. And in general, many of the tribes have two-spirit individuals who encompass both masculine or feminine qualities, so they kind of have a third gender. And they give you another example on page bottom of page 319. It's Nadle, a gender identity that is neither male nor female, and that sanctions non-heterosexual sex as proof that in ancient times, third, possibly fourth genders were accepted and celebrated. And then on the same page, 319, they complicate the culture and tradition of American Indian context, and it's at the top of page 319. So it's really important to read that section on culture and tradition carefully in order to understand the problems associated with stereotypes of Native communities and how tradition and culture has changed or operated since colonization and since trying to contest some of these negative stereotypes of the community. So I think that's really a good place to end there. I want to take us really quickly into chapter 4. So that is arts and cultural production. I'm pausing so we can have a break on YouTube for it. That starts on page 331. The first essay or piece is Poetry Within Earshot, Notes on an Asian American Generation from 1968 to 1978. This piece is beautiful. It really moved me. The power and political activism inherent in poetry and the argument that the author makes about how poetry can quicken our emotions and color our perceptions. That's discussed on page 331. There are absolutely beautiful poets and poems that are examined throughout this piece that I recommend you read slowly, maybe even look up some of the ones that spoke to you in terms of who wrote them and why they were writing them. It's just absolutely imperative that poems are a form of storytelling and empowerment in this piece. And that's discussed on page 332. Above all, we poets were a tribe of storytellers. Throughout place and time, storytellers have shared certain traits. They live in communities where they write for family and friends. Their relationship between the teller and the listener is neighborly because the teller of stories must also listen. It's just absolutely a fabulous essay. They talk about Jeffrey Chan, who is the founder of the first classes on Asian American literature and writing at San Francisco City College at the time of the Third World Strike, which we've talked about. Jeffrey Chan's contributions is discussed on page 333. And then on page 334, they do an excellent job. The author does an excellent job of giving you a quick table in which you can see the similarities and the differences between poetry writing within a Chinese community, a Japanese community, and a Filipino community. And so it shows you similarities, differences, intersections, maybe small intersections. They all had, for instance, civil rights. They all are influenced by ethnic studies and Black power. But when you're looking at something like wars or events that have happened, you'll see under Japanese, you see Hiroshima. Under Filipino, you see U.S. naval bases. So there's some delineations or differences. And then really the rest of the chapter has just analysis of musical poems, memory poems, songs, just specific writers and groups, women who are writing poems. So, and third world women who are writing poems. And the Third World Women Coalition and it's on page 342, it's a coalition of Black, Raza people, Asian American, Indian, and Native Island peoples. They founded the Third World Communications in San Francisco in 1970, and they published Third World Women in 1972. And so they give you some really great resources and examples from when or shortly after, the civil rights movement and when the feminist movement is exploding. So we'll go ahead and skip ahead to the next essay. The next one is about African American artists or Black artists in Los Angeles, a notion of resistance, dignity, and pride. It's called Introduction to Resistance, Dignity, and Pride, African American Artists in Los Angeles. And this one gives you an introductory essay before it zeroes in on case studies almost on specific African American or Black artists that the author wants to highlight from the Los Angeles area. They describe African American art as oppositional political activity and that it supports a resistance culture. It's complex. It's continuing social and economic problems and explaining them. It's about history. This is all discussed at the bottom of page 355, and it continues through the history. It goes all the way through 362. As you're reading this section, I would say look at the keywords in terms of what the art does, what the artists are overcoming in order to be recognized. There's notions of primitivism within their artwork that's discussed at the top of page 358, in which it's not celebrated or exonerated or upheld in the same way as maybe European or certain other art has been. So that's primitivism is discussed a little bit at the top of 358. They talk about how historically Black colleges and universities were the only institutions where the centering of Black culture, intellectual knowledge, the cultural contributions was discussed, and that is shifting now. I would say that Charles White is a pretty important figure to read about. That discussion starts on page 360. He is a dominant figure of the 1960s and 1970s, and they give a great brief historical context of him. And then he's, of course, referenced in some of the pieces in which they're highlighting the authors themselves. I'm going to go through those pieces pretty fast. So the first one is Ernie Barnes on page 364. With him, you're seeing an intersection between sports and art. He was one of the first Blacks that was drafted into professional football, and then how he discovers Charles White's artwork and it influences what he does with his life, both during and after his career. Then if you continue on, you get to Varnette Honeywood, who's talked about on page 372. Again, they use their art to give a more positive image of African American or Black individuals. And she was really powerful in some of her examples of, for instance, telling the history. There's a piece discussed on page 375 that's titled Slavery. It was a collage done in 1973, and it vividly depicts the tragic origins of African American history in the New World. And so they say a picture is worth 1,000 words. Well, then you have art that is worth 1,000 words, 1,000 textbooks. And Honeywood uses this to really communicate deeper realities and get those viewing the artwork to consider how the histories and the past still impacts the present. Then if you continue on with these essays, you're going to get to Samella Lewis. And her pieces, she has a long career of, again, bringing recognition and respect to visual creativity. I would say with her piece, or this essay about her, you can learn more about her career both as an art historian and as a practicing artist. And then there's one last artist that's highlighted before we're done with this section of the chapter, and that's William Pajaud. And his pieces, again, gives glimpses into the lives of African Americans. There's a really powerful piece, a spiritual piece, Wade in the Water, which harkens back to the song Wade in the Water, in which during the slavery time periods, the Blacks or the African Americans would sing resistance songs, and often there were messages in the songs for how to escape slavery and that kind of things. And so he does a piece that harkens back to the Wade in the Water song that the slaves might have sang. And in general, this artist, there's a lot between singing and how singing is represented. Again, the jazz singer, a 1992 watercolor, is discussed at the top of page 388. So these are just some really good snapshots or case studies to show you or to center African American artists. We have 2 more essays I want to look at, and then, yeah. So the next one, then we'll be done with this chapter, is Blood Memory in the Arts, Indigenous Genealogies and Imagined Truth. That starts on page 390. This was a really fascinating read. It talks about the legacy of colonialism, especially how it relates to Indigenous knowledge and Indigenous art production. And it's really important to grapple with that at the beginning of this essay. The aesthetic world and the art world is often fraught with different constraints in terms of fine arts and getting a European training in it, and maybe undermining the value in Indigenous art, which was often art that was usable, like basket weaving or different kinds of materials that were used by the tribe communities. And then, of course, that complex relationship between a a museum viewing versus Indigenous studies or an Indigenous centers viewing, and what it means when art becomes commodities that are exchanged because they're worth a lot of money. So that's all talked about on 390 and 391. The blood memory is a fascinating theoretical concept that's discussed at the bottom of 392 and really carries into the full essay. And so the concept of blood memory, they say here, is ageless, and that it blurs the distinctions between racial identity and narrative. So the author says that this blood memory and blood relationships has to do with the notion that even though the genocides of the indigenous communities caused a lot of knowledge to be lost in the ways in which it was told, for instance, if it was oral storytelling and you kill the storytellers, what's left of that history or culture? And they claim that there is this remembrance that runs deep in Native communities, and it's a form of blood memory that you can't take from them, no matter what was done. And I thought that was really powerful. They give you a film example of how they describe it, and then some artwork as there's some figures related to it. But I think a really good, summary is at the very end of the essay, 400 and 401. I'm going to do the quote on 401. Native literary artists create the tropes of oral stories in the silence of narratives and in the imagist scenes of eternal motion, totemic transmutation, pronoun waves, gender inversion, the presence of creatures, visionary voice, and in a sense of survivance. And I believe that this is really powerful. This notion of oral stories in silence, the silence that was caused through genocide, through death, and the silence that is telling in and of itself as a story, and this constant reemergence, resilience and survival. So I think it's a really powerful way to end this chapter. Please read that imaginary truce that starts at the middle of 400 to 401 closely. The last essay in this lecture is The Oppositional Consciousness of Yolanda M. Lopez. Amazing. Absolutely amazing Chicana artist. I had the pleasure of meeting her before she passed. And I mean, there's just so much in this chapter. The work that she did before feminist scholarship on intersectionality in the 1980s, the work she did for Chicana activists and leaders, the pieces she did about everyday Chicana women, Mexican American women. It's just, she's this complex individual. Absolutely. And there's a really great summary of that on page 406 in the middle. And then on page 407, they get into some theoretical work and the differential consciousness of U.S. third world feminists. And specifically, 4 political modes of resistance are discussed on that page, on page 407. In the middle of the page, that is equal rights, revolutionary, supremacist, and separatist. And they say that it's the ability to merge these that makes the work of U.S. third world feminists historic. And really, Yolanda Lopez is influenced by all that and is living it. They give you great history of her life starting on 408 that they carry into 410, and then from 410 through the end of the chapter, deep analyses of some of her biggest works. You could see there's some images here in the chapter. It's just absolutely beautiful. And some that are referenced that are not shown. And I think that really what you should see of her is her influence for joining the Third World Liberation Front. That's discussed on page 410 and 411, and how much being involved in that strike at what was then San Francisco College, which would become San Francisco State, influenced her later work. How she wanted to depict everyday, like non-glamorous or non-sexual, or just really your average woman, elderly women, showing the droops and the skin sagging and showing it as beautiful, is something to be honored, because it's a testament to the work and the fight that the community and especially the women have had. It's just, this piece just really just makes me really proud to be Chicana, really proud of my Mexican side. And there's a really important piece that's referenced, but the image isn't included here. And it's called Who's the Illegal Alien Pilgrim? It's a very celebrated poster in which there's a native person with an angry snarl and a jabbing finger questioning the European settlers as being the illegal aliens of our nation. So I would say that the theme or the point of a lot of her pieces is discussed at the top of 423, Ordinary Women as the Proposal. And it says that Lopez's investigation of images is part of a larger Chicana feminist movement to locate and create alternative identities for Mexican origin women, an aesthetic method that emerges from her upbringing, her activism and social movements of the 1960s and 1970s, and her training when she goes to graduate school. And again, on page 425 at the bottom, she proposes new subjectivities and encourages Chicanas to invent themselves again and again as she questions the image, its context, and what it accomplishes for them. Projects are never static. We are never static. We are changing, we are growing, we are resisting, we are proud. It's just an excellent piece to end that chapter with. So I know this was a super long lecture. I'm going to try to put in breaks for the individual essays or articles in the chapters as well, so you can skip around based on where you're reading. Reach out with any questions. Thank you.